Well, I want to welcome everyone to this World Order Colloquium. My name is John Eikenberry, and I will be co-hosting this. I want to also recognize my two colleagues, Chika Tanuka and Toya Levshin, who are working with me in this project called Reimagining World Order, which is hosted and sponsored by peers. And we're very proud to be associated with this project and this part of the Princeton University peers. Today, we are very happy to welcome Joshua Derman, who is going to be speaking today on his research. Professor Derman is associate professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He received his bachelor's degree at Harvard and his PhD in history from Princeton University, I think in 2008. He, before moving to Hong Kong, spent a year at the European University Institute as the Max Weber Fellow, and indeed has completed his first book on Max Weber in his first part of his research. Today, he's going to be speaking on new research, and he's going to speak for about 30 minutes. At that point, we will have a short period where Chika and Toya will ask questions, and then we will open things up to the larger audience. Joshua, welcome. The floor is yours for 30 minutes or so, and we look forward to your remarks, and then we will have a open discussion. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Eikenberry, for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to share some of my work with you this afternoon. So I trust everyone can see this. So my talk this afternoon examines a vision of world order that represented one of the main alternatives to liberal internationalism in the 20th century. And that is the vision of a globe partitioned into multinational blocks, each led by a hegemonic great power. During the Second World War, this vision served as official propaganda for the Axis powers. For German speakers, it was encapsulated in the concept of great spaces, or Großräume, a ubiquitous term for the building blocks of the future global order. If you've encountered the concept of great spaces before, it's likely been through the writings of Carl Schmitt, the German law professor and theorist. Shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, Schmitt gave a famous lecture on the international legal order of great spaces, in which he sought to rehabilitate the Monroe Doctrine and apply it to a German-dominated Europe. Because Schmitt has become such an intellectual celebrity in his own right, virtually all of the post-war scholarship on great spaces has focused on Schmitt and the legal debates that he precipitated. But if we focus only on the legal discourse of great spaces, then we may fail to notice one of the main reasons why contemporaries found the idea of a partitioned world so compelling. As I hope to show in this presentation, the German vision of a partitioned world was rooted in a theory of deglobalization that found widespread acceptance in late Weimar and Nazi Germany. The idea that the world economy was undergoing a dialectical transformation from globalization to economic nationalism, and finally, a new world order of great space economies, or in German, Großraumwirtschaften. What made the discourse of great space economy so distinctive was its ability to synthesize opposing perspectives on globalization into a single developmental narrative. Its proponents believed that globalization was inherently self-destructive. Yet, even as they predicted the collapse of the liberal world economy, they maintained that the world was experiencing convergence, not in terms of commodity or factor prices, but through the proliferation of common forms of economic and political integration at the subglobal level. This transformation would not eventuate in isolated blocks, they argued, but in global relationships that yielded a more sustainable form of world economy. Despite its normative rejection of globalization, the theory of great space economy relied on a modern propensity for global thinking, the effort to make sense of local developments in terms of global conjunctures. Between the early 1930s and the end of the Second World War, numerous German writers proposed the creation of a great space economy, an integrated regional bloc that would enable Germany to decouple itself from the liberal world economy. This presentation reconstructs the career of its preeminent theorist, the journalist and Nazi official Ferdinand Friedrich Zimmermann, better known by his nom de plume, Ferdinand Fried. Though largely forgotten today, Fried deserves a closer examination, for he was one of the most imaginative defenders of a world order based on great spaces. More clearly and consistently than any of his contemporaries, he tried to explain how visions of deglobalization and global convergence could exist within the concept of great spaces. His ideas anticipated, and in some cases directly impacted, the propaganda the Nazi regime used to legitimize its hegemony in Europe. Ferdinand Friedrich Zimmermann was born into a middle-class family in the province of Brandenburg. After serving in the First World War, he began a dissertation in economics at the University of Berlin, but quit during the inflation to take a job as a correspondent for the Ullstein newspaper company. In 1929, he joined the editorial board of Die Tat, a journal which soon became the most important mouthpiece of the conservative revolution, the cultural movement whose critique of liberalism and social democracy mobilized intellectual opposition to the Weimar Republic. Zimmermann, now writing under the nom de plume Ferdinand Fried, rapidly became one of Germany's most prominent economic journalists. Fried owed his professional success to his sweeping analysis of the Great Depression. In the final years of the Weimar Republic, he caused a sensation by claiming that the world economic crisis presaged the culmination of a secular trend, the end of capitalism, as the title of his first book stated. Fried predicted the decline of laissez-faire capitalism, free trade, and extensive economic growth, and the end of liberalism as a guiding principle in political life. The cure for Germany's economic ills, he believed, required embracing state planning and economic nationalism while ensuring that mid-sized private enterprises retained the freedom to organize their operations. He argued that Germany could regain its economic sovereignty by developing self-sufficiency in many primary products. But he accepted that its standard of living could not be maintained without importing some necessary raw materials. To secure access to imports without incurring debt and dependency, he recommended that Germany divert its foreign trade towards the agricultural economies of southeastern Europe, using a combination of preferential trade agreements and state-managed barter exchange. Fried and his fellow editors at Die Tat were among the first writers to use the terms great space and great space economy to describe their vision of an integrated economic zone incorporating Germany and southeastern Europe. Crucial to Fried's argument was his claim that Germany's great space economy was consistent with global trends. The most reliable indicator of the world to come, he argued, was the Ottawa Agreements, signed in 1932, in which Britain agreed to waive tariffs on most imports from its empire and impose new or higher duties on non-imperial goods in exchange for preferential treatment of its exports to the Dominions and India. The fact that the former paragon of free trade was now engaged in constructing a preferential trading space signified to him the dawning of a new age of economic spaces. The leaders of the Nazi Party, who were searching for radical economic ideas to incorporate into their program were enthusiastic about Fried's work. All the Gauleiters, and even Hitler himself, were said to have read his book. After Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Fried was able to capitalize on these connections. He was hired by the Minister of Agriculture, Richard Walter Darré, to work at the Reich Food Estate, the new agency that was tasked with setting agricultural prices and regulating food production. He was inducted into the SS in an honorary capacity and subsequently rose to the rank of Sturmbannführer in its race and settlement main office. Fried's tenure in the Nazi bureaucracy lasted less than 2 years. At the beginning of 1936, he took a 6-month leave of absence, initially for health reasons, which he extended repeatedly and never returned. He left Berlin and settled in an Alpine Bavarian village, where he turned his hand to writing articles about the history of the world economy. At first, these efforts produced a short anti-Semitic tract, The Rise of the Jews, which interpreted the history of antiquity from a racist perspective. But by early 1938, he had already begun planning to write a major survey of the world economy. Over the course of the next year and a half, a period in which Hitler's expansive foreign policy brought Europe to the brink of war, Fried attempted to provide the theory of great space economy with a historical backstory and prospect for its future. His book, titled Turning Point of the World Economy, appeared in November 1939, 2 months after the outbreak of the Second World War. The liberal world economy, Fried argued in his book, was unsustainable and ultimately self-destructive. Over the course of the 19th century, he observed, the global division of labor had created concentric zones of specialized production, a macrocosm of the Thunen circles of economic activity that typically emanated from urban areas. This process had transformed independent economies into monocultures, whose fates depended on the vagaries of world markets. A shift in the location of production or a collapse in prices spelled disaster. The production of cash crops for the world market encouraged ruthless exploitation of the soil, resulting in dust bowls and floods in the American Midwest, desertification in Africa, and droughts in Argentina, Canada, and Australia. Global capitalism was not only environmentally unsustainable, it also relied on political structures that were impossible to manage over the longer term. In anticipation of what would later be called the theory of hegemonic stability, Fried claimed that any international economic order presupposed the predominance of a single great power. Only a hegemon could induce other nations to give up their economic independence. But such preeminence, while feasible on a regional level, was historically impossible to sustain on a global scale. For a century, Britain had played the role of global hegemon, but its dominance had generated a host of competitors who ultimately checked its power. The first and most natural consequence of the collapse of globalization, Fried explained, was the reassertion of the nation-state. In the aftermath of World War I, states sought greater self-reliance to protect themselves against potential belligerents and precarious world markets. In the end, however, the traditional nation-state was incapable of fulfilling the productive potential of modern technology. Powerful industrial processes were generating economies of scale that demanded regional integration. The world economy of the future would be based neither on globalization nor radical autarky, Fried argued, but on great spaces, which maintained the viability of the nation-state while incorporating it within a larger economic unit. Writing in the fall of 1939, Fried discerned 7 great economic spaces currently in the process of formation, led by Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union. These great spaces would seek to maximize their resources so as to minimize their exposure to an uncertain world economy. Yet the process of expansion and consolidation could well become violent. Nonetheless, conflicts between great spaces would not preclude the growth of trade among them. In the short run, Fried argued, the striving for self-sufficiency would serve as stimulus to trade among blocs, as each sought to acquire the additional raw materials, capital goods, or labor necessary to develop its own resources. In the long run, technological progress and a rising standard of living would demand greater quantities of some raw materials than could be found between the boundaries of a great space. Rarity monopolies on some desirable raw materials, Canadian nickel and asbestos, Chinese tungsten, Congolese radium, or Indian jute, would persist long after the world's great spaces had reached the limits of their expansion. Prosperous consumers would demand goods that reflected quality monopolies, such as Egyptian cotton, Swiss watches, and German optics. Over time, intercontinental trade would gradually shift from staple commodities towards higher value goods that could be imported without incurring potentially existential dependencies. Just as the Roman, Persian, Indian, and Chinese empires had once coexisted, Fried argued, so can the Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, or Pax Germanica stand equally beside each other. The contrast with antiquity lay in the scale of production. Thanks to industrial technology, commerce in higher value goods would benefit the lives of far greater numbers of people than the luxuries of the ancient world and its empires had done. Only one group, according to Fried, would have no real future in this global order. The collapse of the liberal world economy necessitated the decline in power of the Jews, whom he portrayed as the greatest beneficiaries of the epoch of free trade. Published only 2 months after the outbreak of the Second World War, Fried's book articulated a vision of a new global order that was emerging in the minds of his contemporaries. Though Hitler believed that Germany's economic future depended on territorial conquest rather than world trade, many Nazi officials and intellectuals came to envisage a multipolar world economy that would coalesce after the war had ended. Walter Funk, the Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, announced that Germany would seek to maintain Europe's economic independence in times of emergency, while simultaneously pursuing overseas commerce to ensure a rising standard of living. Numerous economists, officials, and executives echoed Fried's conviction that Europe would remain connected to other economic great spaces in the post-war global order. Nevertheless, the pace of events soon rendered many of Fried's characterizations in his book obsolete. In November 1940, he updated his prognosis in an article titled "The World Economy of Great Spaces." He predicted the forthcoming division of the world into now only 4 blocs, led by the United States, the Soviet Union, Japan, and a German-Italian condominium. He also portrayed the extension of great spaces into the Southern Hemisphere as a global phenomenon. By laying claim to the overseas colonies of their enemies, the Axis powers would acquire what he called supplementary spaces: Africa for Europe, India and Southeast Asia for East Asia, that provided tropical raw materials. Meanwhile, the United States, faced with the prospect of losing access to critical sources of rubber and tin in East Asia, would increasingly turn to South America for its supplies. Fried not only anticipated key tenets of Nazi propaganda, but he also contributed, perhaps unwittingly, to formulating them. The April 1941 issue of Facts in Review, a German propaganda newsletter published in the United States, featured a 2-page article, unsigned, titled "A Bird's Eye View of World Economy." It consisted of maps depicting the world partitioned into 4 spheres of interest. By rendering the entire Western Hemisphere as a single block, the maps implied that a German-dominated Europe did not threaten the United States. By depicting the flow of trade among the blocks on the eve of the war, they suggested that the division of the globe was compatible with a world economy in which both Europe and America played a major role. These maps have since acquired the status of classic Nazi propaganda aimed at securing American neutrality. What has escaped notice, however, is that they were reproductions of the illustrations and captions that accompanied Fried's 1940 article. Fried's ideas appeared in another notable Nazi propaganda document. In 1942, his former colleague at the Reich food estate, Herbert Backe, published a book titled For the Food Independence of Europe, World Economy, or Great Space. Backe was now Minister of Agriculture and the mastermind of a so-called hunger plan to starve tens of millions of Soviet citizens during the war. Backe's book appeared with the same publisher as Fried's, and it covered much of the same ground. It divided the globe into Thunen circles, underscored the precariousness of monocultures, and advanced the claim that free trade was self-destructive, since it degraded the natural environment and led to the industrialization of the non-European world. It portrayed the British Empire as both the chief protagonist of 19th century globalization and the first mover in the formation of great spaces. It also held out the possibility of an intercontinental exchange in specialized goods among the world's great spaces. These similarities did not go unnoticed, and some of Fried's colleagues wondered whether he, in fact, was the real author of Backe's book. The popularity of Fried's ideas cannot be attributed solely to their propaganda value. His efforts to narrate the history of deglobalization from a global perspective also made an intellectual impact on readers. Fernand Braudel, one of the academic pioneers of global history, was an admirer of Fried's work, despite its political content. After being captured in June 1940, the French scholar and officer spent nearly 5 years as a prisoner of war in Germany. In his camp lectures, delivered to fellow prisoners, Braudel referred to Fried's 1939 book with seriousness and even praise, though he found himself unable to endorse its pessimistic vision. Fried's sweeping narrative of the rise and fall of globalization represented, for Braudel, an exemplary mode of historiography. He hailed Fried as one of the best contemporary practitioners of deep history and endorsed his call to search for the deep meaning of events. The most pointed criticism of Fried's ideas came from the German economist Wilhelm Röpke, one of the founding fathers of neoliberalism. In May 1941, writing from Swiss exile, Röpke reviewed Turning Point of the World Economy in a 3-part series for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. According to Röpke, Fried's book conveyed a far-ranging picture of notions that may count as representative for broad and influential circles, which made its message all the more dangerous. Röpke rejected the idea that great spaces could provide a more sustainable basis for the world economy. There was no reason to believe, he argued, that the dinosaurs will one day lie down sated and peacefully beside each other like lambs. Only in a liberal world economy, where states were able to peacefully access economic resources beyond their borders, could the small and large countries of the world live side by side, he argued. In the spring of 1943, Fried embarked on a propaganda blitz across neutral Europe, delivering lectures in Stockholm, Gothenburg, Zurich, and Geneva. Through these interventions, he tried to convince his audience that the post-war economic order would be based neither on free trade nor autarky, but on great spaces. Fried insisted that the post-war world could never return to the liberal international economy of the 19th century, even if the Axis were to lose the war. Only the uncontested domination of a hegemon, a Pax Americana, could guarantee an integrated global economy, he argued. But Fried insisted that the Soviet Union would remain a great power in world politics, only months after the defeat at Stalingrad. If the United States tried to establish its global hegemony at the end of the war, he argued, the Soviet Union would surely rise to contest it. Any post-war attempt to restore the liberal world economy would founder on the clash of the new superpowers. Fried made these pronouncements at a time when the discourse of great spaces was falling into disrepute. At the end of 1942, the propaganda ministry distributed guidelines advising writers to refrain from any speculation about how the world might be divided. But when Fried ultimately ran afoul of the Nazi authorities, it was because his methodology, and not his vision of the post-war economy, raised hackles. In March of 1943, an economics journal published by the Nazi Party Chancellery denounced Fried for being, as they put it, a historical materialist, an intellectual who believed that technology and economics, rather than race, were the driving forces of history. In the wake of this official condemnation, the propaganda ministry made it difficult for Fried to continue publishing. By the summer of 1943, his career in Nazi Germany had effectively come to an end. Fried was arrested by the US Army in November 1945. He spent the following 2.5 years in a succession of internment camps and was brought to Nuremberg in 1947 for interrogation as a potential witness in an upcoming military tribunal. However, he chose not to assist the prosecution. Instead, he wrote a supportive affidavit for his former patron, Richard Walter Darré. The denazification process was not straightforward for Fried. The public prosecutor wanted to charge him with being a major offender. But Fried was able to muster a collection of testimonials from friends and neighbors, attesting to his scorn for the Nazi regime and his connections to elements of the resistance. After considering this evidence, the tribunal classified him as a lesser offender. On appeal, his classification was commuted to fellow traveler, the lowest level of legal culpability. Nothing now stood in the way of resuming his professional life in West Germany. Fried had spent his time in internment camps beginning to write again, and in 1950 he published a revised edition of Turning Point of the World Economy. Though he removed the sections that alluded to the era of National Socialism, he insisted that the predictions he had made in the original 1939 edition still rang true. Even though the war had not ended in an Axis victory, he argued, the world would remain partitioned in a way that precluded the revival of a liberal world economy. A survey of global affairs made this outcome plain to see. In addition to the United States and the Soviet Union, new continental blocs were emerging that would determine the world economy of the future. Europeans were beginning to appreciate the necessity of overcoming the nation state. Mao's China had become an independent power in its own right, alongside India, which was embarking on a policy of industrial self-sufficiency. Opportunities for trade, especially in capital goods, would continue to exist between these blocs, especially in light of their ambitious plans for industrialization and agricultural modernization. Fried argued that a multipolar global order, sustained by these 5 blocs, offered the only viable alternative to the tensions of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, Fried had succeeded in restarting his journalistic career. He began writing for the Sonntagsblatt, a Christian weekly, and then moved to Die Welt, the major conservative daily in West Germany. Initially, Fried drew comparisons between communist Eastern Europe and the regional blocs of the 1930s, and welcomed the prospect of the East Bloc's participation in a new world economy. But by the end of the decade, he had lost confidence in the prospects of a mutually beneficial relationship between West and East. Interbloc commerce remained at an insignificant level. The Soviet Union had no regional specialties to offer, only massive quantities of raw materials, especially oil, whose cheap prices threatened to entrap Western Europe in new geopolitical dependencies. The world economy had been partitioned, as Fried predicted, but the opportunities for exchange remained obscured by Cold War antagonisms. The vision of a thriving world economy of great spaces gradually disappeared from his writings. During the 20th century, the conviction that universal history followed a dialectical logic was embraced not only by Marxists and Cold War liberals, but also by radical conservatives and fascists. Their vision of a shared global experience was expressed through images of partitions, segmentations, and separations, rather than the metaphors of entanglement and connectivity that feature so prominently in 21st century discussions of the global. Behind the growing division of the world, they perceived a common structural process at work, one that rendered the forms of international organization increasingly alike, even as the ties between continents were sundered and rearranged. 75 years after the end of the Second World War, as the world economy faces new crises of its own, specters of global order based on regional blocs have once again emerged, sometimes articulated in images from that earlier cataclysmic era. Proponents of new spheres of influence are unlikely to stake their claims on the basis of the same arguments that Fried advanced. Yet much of his skepticism about the stability of the liberal world economy under conditions of global economic crisis, geopolitical competition, and ecological devastation ring eerily familiar. His vision retains its significance as a paradigmatic global theory of deglobalization, a topic that may gain in relevance as the institutions that sustained our most recent age of internationalism encounter powerful new challenges. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Joshua. That was utterly fascinating, and I'm sure you will have many questions before you in a minute. I just will kick things off and then let Toya and Chika ask questions, and then we'll open it up. I wanted just to ask a little bit about, more specifically about Fried's critique of globalization. And there seem to be two pieces to his argument. One is a kind of techno-economic argument about the unsustainability of global integrated markets. And one is a power political argument about hegemony and the incapacity of any particular state to function globally as a hegemon. So is that how you see it? And what is driving the story? Is it primarily a kind of, again, a kind of technological materialist argument about the nature of capitalism as it enters in the middle part of the 20th century? Or is this about power and hegemony? So where's the center or the core of his critique?
Thanks. I think he offers a number of different arguments that don't all necessarily boil down to the same point, as you've suggested. At the beginning of his career in 1931, he writes a book called The End of Capitalism, which is focused primarily on discussing the forces he believes are responsible for the collapse of capitalism more generally. And he discusses the world economy in the course of that discussion, but it's not the central focus. And in that book, he advances a technological argument, which is in some ways quite familiar. He argues that the age of great technological disruption is over, and that there will never again be an innovation on the level of the steam engine or electricity or the combustion engine. And that with the exception of the airplane, those great disruptions are over, and that's going to necessarily result in a decline in growth. I mean, it is kind of reminiscent of Robert Gordon's arguments about sort of secular stagnation in the later part of the 20th century, although it anticipates it by many decades. There are degrees to which Fried kind of piggybacks on arguments that were made by a professor of his in Berlin, Werner Sombart, who has a very grim prediction about the forces that are eating away both technologically and spiritually with capitalism. So that is a core interest of his. Fried also subscribes to something that was called the diminishing trade hypothesis at the time. The idea that as the non-industrialized world industrialized, the global division of labor would collapse, the market for European manufactured exports would dry up, and the entire kind of world economy would go out of sync. But when he writes his book in 1939 about the turning point of the world economy, the two factors that he seems to emphasize most are environmental degradation, the idea that the world economy and its monocultures are unsustainable, that over-specialization leads to droughts, dust bowls, all sorts of kind of global weirding, you might call. And the second argument is to do with hegemony, that it's sustainable on a regional level, that all integrated economies require some sort of hegemon, even regionally, but globally, with the exception of the period of British dominance in the 19th century, this can't be sustained. So I think there are sort of the three arguments: the technological, the ecological, and then the hegemonic political argument.
Thank you. Chika, do you want to go ahead and...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. I want to ask you about how this world of great spaces was intended to differ from a world of empires. And I'm thinking that partly because one context in which I've come across practical application of this kind of vision is Japan in the 1940s, when they set up the so-called Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere, very much, inspired by this kind of theory. And I think people even may have been reading, what Fried was writing. But that particular example shows that, especially at the planning stage, there was quite a lot of internal debate and contestation over how Japan as the hegemon should relate to the rest of the region, and whether the regional bloc economy ought to be run in such a way that it preserves the permanent supremacy of Japan or not. And it seemed like the underlying dilemma in that story is how to actually differentiate it from classic, like 19th century Western imperialism, and say this isn't just about capitalist exploitation, this is about co-prosperity, regional development, freedom, equality, etc. But in practice, of course, they just want to reduce the region to their own resource supply post, right? So, what's the kind of theoretical vision, and does he actually reflect on that differentiation and these dilemmas?
Thanks. Yeah, and there are absolutely very strong parallels to the discussion in Japan with the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere at the same time. The idea that the world was going to be partitioned had a longer history beyond the story that I told this afternoon. And it goes back to the last decades of the 19th century, when writers, academics, journalists, not just in Germany, but in France, Britain, Russia, the United States, anticipated the division of the world into at least what the Germans called Weltreiche, or world empires. The idea that there was going to be a scramble to divide up the world among imperial formations. And one of the apparent signs of this for many observers, at least in Germany, was the rise of protectionist barriers in the US and Russia and elsewhere. And certainly at the end of the 19th century, the idea of a partitioned world becomes an ideology of 19th century imperialism and the scramble. So it definitely could be mobilized and was mobilized for that purpose. And Fried is aware of those continuities, but he thinks that the moment in which he's writing is different. And there's something that makes it, there are a couple of factors that make it different from that late 19th century story. And one of those important factors is World War I and the collapse of empires. And in the view of Fried and his contemporaries, all of the world's empires in the period immediately after the First World War, they undergo an important transformation. And that is that they have to reckon with the rise of nationalism. a desire for national autonomy. And that's something that the successful empires, in his view, and the view of his contemporaries, all have to acknowledge and somehow accommodate. The new empires of the interwar period are going to be empires that can devolve some degree of autonomy or recognition either to independent states in their orbit, or they transform themselves into kind of more federalistic unions, like the British Commonwealth, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Japanese effort to create satellite states in Manchukuo and elsewhere. And Fried and his fellows see this as a kind of global phenomenon. It's a natural stage in the evolution of empire away from what they call Herrschaft, sort of out-and-out domination, towards something more like informal empire, a kind of imperialism, although they wouldn't even want to use that term necessarily, that acknowledges national existence or national autonomy to some degree. And that's embedded in the kind of dialectic or the economic dialectic that Fried discusses in his book, the idea that first you begin with a global world economy, and which takes away power from nation states and makes their lives precarious. Then you have a backlash in which nation states seek to maintain their integrity, their self-sufficiency. And then whatever comes next in the swing of the dialectic, this move towards great spaces, certainly it's going to diminish some of that power of the individual nation state, but it's going to preserve its existence to a certain degree. States will never, even within great spaces, according to Fried, and this was the ideology, would experience the same kind of precariousness that they did in some cases in the 19th century. So it's a new kind of imperialism that has sort of made accommodations to nationalism, which they all believe is a kind of force in the 20th century, which you can't really suppress. That was the ideology. The reality, of course, very different.
Joshua, thank you very much for a very exciting presentation. This was fascinating. I have a sort of an amateur interest in the works of Carl Schmitt, so a lot of the topics resonated with me. And in a way, I would like to put to you a question that has always fascinated me about Schmitt, and it really applies to Fried as well. And I hope you can answer this for me. To what extent do we actually have here a distinctive vision of a different international order? So I will make this question precise in terms of the typology of international orders that Gilpin offers in his book, War and Change and World Politics, where we can sort of think about world orders in terms of the constituent units. We can think about the size of those units, the type of those units, and we can think about the types of interactions that occur between the units. And so it seems to me that if we just purely look at the ontological level, the sense that we're going to have a world that is divided into different units, that is partitioned in this fundamental ontological sense, the idea of partition is not particularly different from what happened at the Peace of Westphalia, as IR scholars anachronistically call it. It's not too different from what liberal internationalism builds upon. So the level of ontology, there doesn't seem to be a difference. If we look at the types of units or the size of units that constitute the image, we can find many other people, both before Fried and after Fried, who also argued for big states forming these blocks. So for example, E.H. Carr, very famously, in his visions for a post-war order, he argued that only big spaces would be sustainable, which of course was at odds with self-determination. And so he leveled a critique of self-determination from an economic standpoint. Simultaneously, Robert Gilpin, in that book, cites a number of scholars who argue that the optimal size of states today is at the level of what previously we would call these great continental empires. So there doesn't seem to be anything distinctive at the level of size either. And that brings us to the level of rules, institutions, and these broad ritualistic visions of order, where it seems to me there's plausibly the most room for making an argument for how this order can be different, for how this partitioned order can be different. So were there any specific arguments for particular rules, particular rituals, rules of law, rules of morality that would set this partitioned order apart from other visions of partitioned order?
It's a great question. But let me see how I could try to answer it. I think the milieu of people who I'm looking at or have sort of scratched the surface of in this presentation, they would very much agree with you in the sense they don't see this as a radically new approach to global order, but as a kind of update of older schemes of world order that have been adapted for peculiarly modern circumstances, or at least that would be my understanding. And maybe I'll expand a little bit for a moment on something that I alluded to in my presentation. Fried, like many classically trained gymnasiasts and people who went to high schools that studied Latin and Greek in the early 20th century in Germany, was obsessed with classical antiquity. And he writes, two anti-Semitic books in the late 30s about the ancient world, about the Middle East, and about Rome as well. And the images of antiquity occur very prominently in this book he publishes in 1939, Turning Point of the World Economy. And Fried discusses very explicitly the Eurasian economy of antiquity. A moment in time when you have these world empires that occupy different corners of Eurasia, the Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Qin and Han empires in East Asia, empires in subcontinental India. And they all coexist. They fight with each other. There's conflict in the borderlands and the margins. So it's not an irenic order. There is conflict. But the conflicts are kind of border disputes, and they don't necessarily upset the basis for that generally peaceful coexistence. And they trade amongst each other in luxury goods, silks, high quality craftsmanship, furs, that kinds of stuff. And of course, the trade is in relatively low volumes, and it's has lots of intermediaries. But it happens, and it's very important in the Silk Road and in the Indian Ocean. And Fried sees the world of the mid-20th century as heading back in that direction. It will be divided between these large, largely self-sufficient hegemonic spaces. But this order, which has proved successful in earlier periods of time, is going to be updated. It's going to be updated for the industrial age. So trade will not be in small quantities of luxury goods for a tiny elite, but will be in machine tools or optics or watches or rare earth metals, which will benefit much larger groups of people than those silks or spices ever did. These empires in the 20th century, if you want to call them empires, and not all of these guys wanted to, will really consist of independent nation states. Of course, independence is a nominal term in many cases, but these guys, at least in the early 30s, took that notion of national autonomy seriously in the sense that they thought we're not looking at one single imperial bloc. We're looking at a kind of congery of states that come together under a hegemon. And of course, parallels, of course, to the Hellenic world there too. So I'm not sure if that completely provides a satisfying answer to the question, but I think
I'm going to keep going.
This is very quick. Would it be fair then to say, just by way of summarizing what you just said, that it's an institutionally bare vision?
Institutionally
bare.
Bare.
There's
absolutely, that's right. There are no institutions, but that's in their mind the beauty of it. The institutions are that they were familiar with, the League of Nations, for example. They viewed these as simply instruments of an Anglo-Saxon hegemony, and that in this kind of world order based on a kind of balance of power, you wouldn't need institutions. It would be a more transparent order where you couldn't, in their view, hide behind a kind of universalistic ideology or ostensibly universalistically minded institutions.
Thank you. Natasha?
Thank you. Thanks for the event, and thank you, Joshua, for coming and speaking to us today. A really, really interesting topic. So I have two questions. The first just really extends the line of questioning from our first two questions, which I really see is pushing you to kind of delimit for us to a greater extent how you're defining this topic or what's at stake in the decisions you've made in framing it in the way you have. Because, it seems like in some ways it's quite easy to be like, gotcha, Grossräume, into the Nazis, and it's kind of a spectacular story. But to me, in some ways, like the headline of this story, of this line of thinking in this period is its incredible prevalence, right? I mean, so it really comes down to how much you've got at stake in the Grossraum term, because if you just change the linguistic register to federations, right, or federalism, it's absolutely everywhere. And especially, we don't need to go as far away as Japan. We can think about the former Habsburg lands that in the wake of Habsburg collapse are just riddled with schemes, that have exactly the same analysis, right? That we need a larger economic space, that globalization, the globe doesn't work, but neither does the nation. And so how can we kind of find a way of recognizing some sort of national independence while also having larger economic units? And so, it's interesting if you enlarge that kind of linguistic spectrum a little bit, a lot of things change. First of all, to do with the political content, right? I mean, you had someone like Röpke as your critic, but of course, as Slobodian's Globalist shows, I mean, all kinds of these neoliberal thinkers are thinking in terms of federations as well, right? It also, you phrased it as a retreat from globalization. It's also a move above the nation, right? So it kind of, whether you frame it as deglobalization or as federation, like it's also supranationalism, right? So it kind of, in your framing, we have embedded what is the kind of normal natural unit, right? So you could tell this story also as an expansion above, the framework of the nation rather than a retreat from the globe. But that shift would also allow you to think about other sorts of post-World War II continuities, i.e. into things like the EU, right? And those initial kind of attempts to create an economic federation. This thinking doesn't go away. In fact, you could say that we are still living with it. Second question, and it'll be shorter. I was really intrigued by your references to what we could call the philosophy of history. So you have this line about dialectical visions of history, but you also mentioned Brodel, key theorist of long time frames. So I was wondering if you could kind of tease out this line of your paper or project a little bit more. And I kind of wondered if you were inching towards some sort of sense where actually, we're focusing on great spaces, but what's involved here is also a vision of great times, right? That you have these very long durations or very long kind of historical visions that are actually embedded in politics of that scale. So if you could talk about the relationship of geographic and temporal scale, perhaps.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the question of federations, I absolutely agree. I think this is a moment in the sort of early mid-century, or even earlier in the aftermath of World War I, where many, if not most observers, are all aware that there has to be some kind of middle ground between the nation state and what had previously been imperial units, and then on the highest level, the globe. And it can be achieved either through international organizations and institutions like the League, or it can be achieved through more hegemonic unions, sort of integration at the subglobal level, and then finding ways to knit those blocks together themselves into some kind of global order. So there's an interesting parallelism in that there's certain assumptions that everyone takes for granted. I think not everyone, but very many observers. The idea that federalism is going to be a core principle in future international organization, but whether that federalism is democratic, whether it's hegemonic, to what extent one accepts or endorses the principles of power as being necessary, to what extent one subscribes to a vision of kind of negotiated compromise. I think maybe that's what sets some of these people apart. And of course, there are people like Röpke who still are attached to the idea of a kind of integrated liberal world economy, though they themselves, even in this criticism that Röpke writes of Fried, acknowledge that the world isn't going back to the 19th century liberal economy, and that whatever federal organization you're going to have in the future is going to acknowledge some hegemons. And the UN Security Council certainly has its hegemons, who have power and a say that others may not have. So there are these continuities, and I would like to draw out those parallels more as I develop this project. Your question about great times rather than great spaces, that's a great analogy, and I have to think more about how to develop it further. Fried's perspective, and what fascinates Brodel so much about it, is that it is precisely longue durée. It tries to tell a story about the rise and fall of globalization on a global scale, with similar processes happening to everybody at the same time. And I guess such a longue durée vision doesn't necessarily need to end in a vision of great spaces, I think, but perhaps it's one possible alternative. If you think that history is driven by forces that are happening to everybody at the same time and are leading them, despite local differences, into somewhat parallel or homologous solutions to the same problems, then you could as well wind up in a vision of a partitioned world as you could in one of an integrated one. And I think that's the kind of perverse and fascinating twist to Fried's argument.
Thank you very much. Harold?
So thanks, Josh. This is fantastic, really very, very interesting and very nice presentation. I had some questions, but basically they've been, two of the big questions were asked already. One about the relationship to classical 19th century empires, so Chika asked about that. And Talia asked about the interplay between this and E.H. Carr. I think the Carr story is actually very, very analogous. Carr actually in the 20 Years Crisis has a lot of the technological story of the end of capitalism as well. So it looks really just a kind of English language version of what you're talking about, and the kind of mental world of them is very similar. But the third question that I had hasn't been asked yet, and it's the role of anti-Semitism in all of this. Is the anti-Semitism peripheral or ephemeral, or is it really central to the vision? Because obviously, you talked about Zombat. There's this identification of Jews with capitalism, with capitalist internationalism. You can go back further. There's some of this in Marx, obviously, and these notorious writings in the 1840s on the Judenfrage. But then I wondered about the book, which I haven't read. I've read The End of Capitalism, Das Ende des Kapitalismus, but I haven't read the book about the long-term history at the end of the 1930s about the ancient world. And, I wondered what the role of the Jews was there, and whether you could explain that a bit, because it seemed to me that it was possible that you could have a story about the destruction of the ancient world and of the ancient world economy because of a radical Jewish doctrine. But that radical Jewish doctrine is Christianity. And then you get into the kind of Gibbon story of how it's Christianity that pushes the decline of the Roman Empire and blows up the Roman Empire, because the idea then is that Christianity has both an anti-imperial and a kind of anti-capitalist or anti-business worldview. Can you maybe say something about modern anti-Semitism and modern anti-capitalism, but also about the classical aspect of it?
Yeah, thanks, Harold. Anti-Semitism plays a somewhat ambiguous role in Fried's writings, and I wouldn't want to minimize it. The book that he writes in 1937, The Rise of the Jews, is deeply anti-Semitic, and racism is at its very core. He argues that the rise of a kind of classical world economy in the Middle East and all of the baleful associations that he makes with it are directly the result of Semitic peoples, the Phoenicians first, and then the Jews. This is a book which is then cited and excerpted in other Nazi publications by the SS and others. So it's clearly recognized even at the time as being an important anti-Semitic work. And in that account of ancient capitalism, race and anti-Semitism plays a very important role for Fried. But it almost entirely disappears in his 1939 book. There are two references to Jews in it, both kind of offhand references saying that Jews had benefited by the liberal world economy of the 19th century and that the move to great spaces will curb their power. And in his writings from the early 30s, prior to the rise of the Third Reich, I have not been able to find any notable anti-Semitic references. So it's hard to say. I wouldn't say that his anti-Semitism was opportunistic. I think it was important for him, but it was important at some moments and for some projects. And for I think the longer term story he wants to tell about post-classical capitalism, Middle Ages, the early modern period, the modern period, it doesn't seem to arise. Jews are portrayed not as its progenitors, but as its beneficiaries. And I'm not sure entirely how to explain that shift in focus.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, what about Christianity?
And Christianity.
Christianity in the Roman Empire and
Christian Roman Empire.
The worldview of Christianity.
I don't believe there's any real discussion of Christianity and the role that it is alleged to play in the collapse of the Roman Empire and continuities that one would draw within Judaism. There's, to my knowledge, no mention of a really religion as a analytic category or kind of communities of religion in Fried's economic history.
Thanks.
Philip?
Great. Hi, Josh. It's good to see you again after all these years. I want to follow up on Harold's question, then also raise a couple of other things. So I presume the anti-Semitism drops out of his discourse, but it seems like this happens even before the war. Do you have an explanation for that? And the racism question is bigger than Jews. Is there a vocation for the North to dominate the South, for whites to dominate Asians and Africans? Does racism appear inside the blocks that he constructs? My second question is a little bit about his reconversion after the war, and I presume the anti-Semitism and racism, to the extent it's there, dissipates. But how about ecology? Does that continue to play a role? And is this part of a recuperation of Fried's reputation? Does he get recognized by Greens in some way? And it's just a minor question. Why does he use a nom de plume? What's wrong with Zimmermann? I mean, maybe it's obvious to somebody who knows, but not to me. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Phil. So the question about race more generally in Fried's work and whether he discusses kind of racial hierarchies beyond anti-Semitism as well. In his 1939 book, he argues that any kind of regional integrated economy has to be based on the predominance of a single folk. And folk can be sometimes an ambiguous word. Does it mean nation? Does it mean ethne? Does it mean race? And in his writings, there's room to interpret in all of those directions. When he talks about the British Empire, he says it's basically based on the hegemony of a white Anglo-Saxon kind of settler race, which knits the Commonwealth together. So that's clearly a racial argument. When he talks about Europe, or the kind of Europe that he sees forming, or East Central Europe under German hegemony, he says this region isn't völkischly homogeneous. It's not kind of racially or ethnically homogeneous. It's going to be tied together by bonds of culture and history. So here he imagines that, while race can play a role, or racial homogeneity, in knitting together, providing some sort of objective basis for uniting the member states of a great space, it's not the only factor. It's not a universal principle. It's one of a number of different things that can provide this kind of glue. After the war, I haven't come across any anti-Semitic references. I think he also would have known better for his own career if he held them to mention them. So those don't appear. In terms of ecology, I'm not aware of ecologically minded writers after the Second World War invoking him, but who was fascinated by Fried's writings on ecology was Brodel. And when he refers to Fried at some length in these camp lectures that he delivers in the early 40s, the passages in Fried's writing that he refers to most often are these visions of environmental degradation, of kind of similar kind of ecological devastation happening in different parts of the world. And of course, that is aligned with Brodel's own interests in kind of ecology as being one of these longue durée forces. But it isn't picked up by others, perhaps surprisingly. But perhaps I think Fried's reputation from that period of time also may have militated against it. In terms of his nom de plume, so Fried begins his career in the late 20s writing for the Ullstein newspaper company, which was a fairly liberal, liberally political press conglomerate. And he starts sort of moonlighting in the fall of 1929 for Die Tat, which is clearly a much more conservative and radical outlet. And from what I've been able to gather, I think he didn't want the employers at his day job to know what he was up to, because he thought he would get fired. And so he decided to write under a kind of contraction or truncation of his first and middle name, Ferdinand Friedrich, Ferdinand Fried. And then once he discovers that his professional future is better insured with Die Tat than with the Ullstein company, he quits, I think, in 1930 or 31 and moves full time. But throughout his career, which is sometimes confusing if you're searching for records of him, he publishes under the name of Friedrich Zimmermann, Ferdinand Fried Zimmermann, Ferdinand Fried. He seems to use permutations of these throughout. He's not terribly consistent.
Can I just make an observation?
Sure.
Your response prompts me to. It has something to do with the social history or the rise of social history in the 1960s and 1970s, often attributed to Marxist influences and not wrongly. But you're suggesting another genealogy, and other names come to mind in this connection, like Philippe Ariès, whose Action Française, or Werner Konze. And now we have yet somebody else. It's just an observation that you've led me to.
Yeah, and there were other German authors, economic historians, precisely from this period, who were cited by Brodel and others. Fritz Röhrig, kind of I think urban and international economic historian, also a source for Brodel. And Fried appears actually in the first edition of La Méditerranée, cited in the footnotes. It disappears in the subsequent editions, but in the 48 edition, there are numerous references to Fried in the footnotes. And you can actually still find one in the English translation too.
Great, thank you. I'm looking for any hands that may be up. I had one more question I want to ask. It's really following up on one of the strands.
Thank you, Joshua, actually, for inviting me. I had a quick question.
Oh, please. Yes,
sorry.
Go ahead.
With respect to modern day anti-Semitism, I just first of all, named CJ Okoye. Thanks, Joshua, for inviting me. Pretty interesting conversation. Delved into more literature with respect to what's going on right now with the Jews of Africa, which are actually the Igbo tribe in what's called Southern. There's like certain contemporary literature or movies that have been made about the connection between the Igbos and the The reason why I wanted to know your opinion about this is because currently there's been a bit of I would say, agitation right now in southern Nigeria. Basically where there's been social killings and unfortunately, again, again.
Can anybody hear? I'm sorry to break
I'm
in.
having trouble
I
hearing.
can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that.
Can
Oh,
you
okay, I'll
write the
just repeat
question?
that part.
Sure.
Did you hear, Joshua, did you hear enough to answer?
Oh, okay.
I only heard the beginning of the question.
Could you ask the question in the chat box so that we could
Yes, I could do that.
read the question?
I can do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Well, while you're doing that, I'm just going to look to see if anybody else wanted to chime in. I was just going to ask a little bit more about the nature of Fried's critique of sort of Anglo-America and the liberal domestic project. It's clearly a critique of global capitalism and globalization as a kind of capitalist project, but there doesn't seem to be, in the same way you would find in Schmitt, a critique of the domestic institutions of liberal democracy. So is there a kind of live and let live, that there's no specific theoretical claim about the performance capacity of different kinds of regimes, or is there? So the light, there's kind of a light version of Fried, which is really a kind of an international level interdependence, power, institutions, regionalism, but not really a deeper critique of modernity and the way in which different regimes may rise and fall in the midst of all of these powerful forces. How much does he dig into we'll call it the domestic polities of these rival regional powers?
He doesn't dig in very deep into their domestic policies. And some of his journalism from the early 30s, at the end of the Weimar Republic, when he's talking about international economics and reparations, then he addresses specific issues. But in this later work that has a more world historical scope, he doesn't. And I think, exactly as you pointed out, it does distinguish him from Schmitt. And that distinction is important. Schmitt presents his vision of great spaces as a kind of challenge to the status quo, as a critique of the Anglo-Saxon powers. He does sort of invoke the Monroe Doctrine from the early 19th century as a paradigm, but it's a paradigm that he claims the Americans have forsaken. They've moved away from some good core principle, and now they're only concerned with power and universalism. So this is key to Schmitt's argument, outlining the hypocrisy of the Americans and the British. And Fried doesn't really want to do that. And I think that's because his optic is a different one. He wants to paint this order that's coming into being not as a challenge or an overturning of the order that or I should say it again, it's not a challenge or an overturning of the kinds of international orders that have been set up by the liberal powers, but it's part of their natural evolution. They're all heading in the same direction.
Yeah.
Some more quickly, some more slowly. And so thus he's kind of less critical. In a way, he's sympathetic to what he sees are tendencies that are in line with Germany's own. Oh, I see Theodosi's question about anti-Semitism in southern Nigeria, the Hausa tribe suppressing the Igbos while Britain is blasé. It's a fascinating topic, one that I'm not aware of and would like to know more about. Unfortunately, I can't speak to it. But if you have any suggestions about how to learn more about it, I would be interested.
Toya and Chika, I'm going to turn it over.
Okay.
Comments. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our session. So I'll just let each of you, if you have any final thoughts before we thank our speaker.
Maybe just a quick question then, Joshua. If you were to explain the significance of your research to someone who's not an historian or intellectual historian, what would you give us the biggest takeaway of your research? And I'm asking as a historian.
Okay. A hard question for historians to answer. I think what drew me to this project initially was a kind of fascination with moments in modernity where it looks as if world orders are changing in the sort of Gilpinian sense, and that new possibilities are emerging, but ones that are different from those that actually did happen or that we take for granted. And I think there are moments in the 20th century like 1989, which have certainly been studied, but I think 1940 is another one in which certain vistas of global order and economic order and political order open up. And they were extremely persuasive for many people, not just in the Axis countries, but also in the Allied and the neutral ones. These moments of alternatives, they have a kind of subterranean existence in the 20th century and also in the 21st. They have a way of sort of percolating and bubbling up to the surface at other times. And I think this is one of those visions. It has a particular force at a time and place in the 30s and 40s and early 50s. But I think we haven't heard the end of it either. And I think it's a vision of how to organize the world and how to think of the individual's place in a kind of global society that that probably will have purchase for people in the years ahead. So I think it's interesting to see where it came from and what it might mean.
Tolia, do you have a last point?
Yes. I would like to ask a question, sort of a broad question as well, about what this story tells us about creativity when it comes to projects for alternative international orders, as well as just for organizing political spaces more generally. What does your research tell you about the sources of institutional creativity, if we use this term? Is institutional creativity in our ability to imagine alternative ways of organizing global spaces or sub-global spaces, is it fundamentally a function of recycling or reassembling ideas that we find in the past, articulated, for example, by statesmen or philosophers, or maybe artists? Or is it more a function of spontaneous creativity, you genuinely arriving on the spot with a new idea that is quite unprecedented, and that idea then propagating in that period? What would you say? Thank you.
About the sources of institutional creativity, where they come from, how they emerge, why they glom onto people at a certain moment in time. This issue of reception is always one that's interested me a lot. And I've in the past tried to look at it with sort of canonical figures. Why do certain canonical high academic ideas find their way into people's everyday speech or the way they look at the world? And I would say my approach to intellectual history is oftentimes at looking at the way in which the ordinary people use theory to orient themselves in their confusing present moments. I think Fried is not a canonical intellectual. He's certainly someone who tries to synthesize and popularize ideas that do come from other canonical intellectuals like Sombart and German economists. What accounts for the alignment between these ideas at a certain moment and realities? I think it's sometimes a serendipitous one. I think also there are individuals who can sort of see the vectors departing from any single point in time and can sort of tell a story about where they go in a plausible way. And those alternate stories, fortunately, in many cases, turn out not to be true ones, but they build on tendencies that people perceive in their present moment. I've always been fascinated how Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World in 1936. What was it about the interwar period that resulted in such an eerie premonition of the post-war world and our world? Clearly, there must have been something in that moment, in that conjuncture, that allows people to perceive kind of deeper forces under the surface. There was one question that came in over the chat, which I wanted to address if there is still 1 minute left.
Yes.
I was asked, don't you think it would be inappropriate and outdated to use Nazi propaganda writer works to analyze and predict the modern times? It probably would be inappropriate to do so. And I wouldn't want to suggest at all that I'm endorsing Fried's vision, or that I think it is a normatively good guide to where the world should be heading. Quite the contrary. I think Fried is relevant today because his temperament and the issues that preoccupied him and that led him to this dark vision, or dark from, I think, our perspective of where the world is heading, are ideas and temperaments that are still around today and perhaps on the upsurge. And so I think Fried is not a normative guide to the present, at least not for me, but I think he is a figure who helps us perhaps to better understand ideas and currents that are out there today. And that is a worthwhile endeavor, I think, for anybody.
Well, that's a very eloquent way to end this fascinating discussion. Joshua, thank you so much. This has just been terrific. And I know it's very, very, very early in the morning where you are. So well done. Thank you
thank you so much for having me.
For being here. And we look forward to hosting you in person on the other side of this pandemic. But this has been terrific. And it's been particularly special given this project, which is very much eager to hear the voices that you're bringing forward as we debate reimagining world order. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And thank you everyone for coming. We'll keep you in the loop.
A pleasure to meet you even a little bit indirectly, Joshua. So thank
Nice
you again for joining us
Yeah.
over Zoom, and look forward to a longer conversation about all these themes at a later date, whenever we get to do that.
Absolutely. Thanks.